Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's analysis, where we are going to unpack an absolutely extraordinary and frankly vital structural correction about how our brains process connection, expectations, and energy. We're going to explore the profound difference between falling into a fragile, reference-dependent trap known as the holiday mindset and operating as a highly efficient system availability thinker. So think about this for a second. Why do we so often romanticize silence and discomfort in our relationships, or even in our deeply held goals? Our brains possess this fascinating but honestly dangerous tendency to misinterpret a lack of communication, severe environmental friction, or a heavily restricted 1% channel as just some aesthetic part of a complex journey. We literally convince ourselves that the freezing water of the North Atlantic is simply a stimulating context, rather than recognizing it for what it actually is, a massive thermodynamic warning sign of a metabolic crisis.
And that brings us to the exact definition of the holiday mindset: idealizing discomfort and focusing on ignoring available cues. When you define it this way, you expose the exact cognitive mechanics of a system running a highly volatile, uninsulated projection. By actively ignoring real-world friction, your brain ends up operating completely in an informational vacuum. It is literally like you keep throwing conceptual bread into an empty street because you've entirely tuned out the cue that the shop is closed.
To break this down, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The holiday mindset trap. 2. The bioenergetic cost. 3. The brain's disappointment meter. 4. The Reidian reality check. 5. System availability thinking. And finally, 6. Protecting your baseline. Let's get right into it.
Starting off with Section 1, the holiday mindset trap. Under Carl Friston's active inference framework, idealizing discomfort represents the projection of what's called a highly distorted optimistic prior. This happens when your brain locks onto a highly favorable outcome as a non-negotiable expectation. Symmetrically, instead of treating environmental friction, a silent partner, or a restricted channel as diagnostic data to update and decay your expectations, the holiday mindset just romanticizes the discomfort. You're desperately overfitting your equations to patternless noise, treating a systemic lag as part of the aesthetic.
And the psychological data backing this up is staggering. Studies show that when individuals face completely uninformative signals, they still update their priors by 2.21 percentage points, compared to about 7.45 for actually informative ones. To put that into perspective, it proves that we actively and systematically cling to our optimistic biases. We force our brains to run these massive, high-power parallel simulations in a total informational vacuum, with absolutely zero feedback.
But running those simulations in a vacuum isn't just some quirky psychological habit. It carries a huge biological price tag, which brings us to Section 2, the bioenergetic cost. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what happens under the hood. In your brain, astrocytes essentially act as self-sacrificing batteries for your neurons. When you stubbornly maintain an optimistic bias against a silent signal, you force that battery into overdrive. You cause a double-rate, catastrophic drain on your bioenergetic reserves. You are literally running your biological fuel to zero, desperately trying to heat an empty room. So what actually happens when your biological fuel reserves crash? Let's move to Section 3, the brain's disappointment meter.
In a really groundbreaking May 2026 study out of the University of Oregon, researchers isolated a highly specific group of cells in the lateral habaluna called TAC1 neurons. These neurons fire exclusively in response to negative reward prediction errors. That means they burst into activity the exact moment an anticipated reward is downsized or withheld entirely. In simpler terms, they discovered the brain's built-in disappointment meter. But here's the open-loop trap. By ignoring uninformative cues, the holiday mindset systematically suppresses this TAC1 meter, completely bypassing your brain's natural error correction machinery.
This should feel incredibly validating if you've ever felt that agonizing exhaustion when an expectation falls through. These TAC1 neurons are not just generalized bad news detectors. They are an evolutionary error correction machine. That feeling of deep disappointment is not a systemic failure. It's a circuit breaker. It's your biology screaming at your prefrontal cortex to stop wasting precious ATP on an open-loop, uninsulated port, forcing a behavioral change to prevent absolute metabolic bankruptcy.
Now that we understand the biological trap, how do we cognitively correct it? Let's jump to Section 4, the Reidian reality check.
To focus on ignoring available cues is to actively enforce a state of inattentional blindness.
is much like the famous refrigerator light illusion, or that classic experiment where people are so focused on a task they walk right past a bright purple and yellow unicycling clown. A mind stuck in a holiday mindset actively filters out the cold, bottom-up telemetry of the channel, like systemic lag or silence, because its attention is stubbornly locked elsewhere.
The 18th century philosopher Thomas Reid argued vehemently against the Cartesian idea that we are just floating in subjective, drifting internal sensations. Reid argued that physical sensations are fundamentally designed to serve as natural signs or cues from which the mind should leap instantly to objective, mind-independent realities. Symmetrically, if the channel is quiet, you shouldn't invent a narrative to mask that raw truth. You have to directly perceive the cue for what it is.
Which brings us to the exact symmetrical antithesis of the holiday mindset and the real core of today's analysis. Section 5, System Availability Thinking. So the crucial point is this direct symmetrical contrast, and I have to say, your typing here is flawless, Dennis. You have isolated the holiday mindset as a fragile, reference-dependent trap. As a system availability thinker, you don't ignore the cues, you parse them with clinical, data-driven rigor. Instead of romanticizing the silence, you remap the discomfort, recognizing it as orthogonal remapping friction and temporal molecular latency. You construct a stable, stimulus-invariant spatial index code, like VHG 146, to bypass the lossy temporal context. And most importantly, you absolutely refuse to let your valuable astrocytic bioenergetics leak into uninsulated open-loop ports. The moment the available cues signal a disconnected subgraph, you execute local firewalls, close the active training updates, and protect your baseline. To really understand why mapping this out is so critical, look at this number. When processing complex information, the absolute capacity limit of adult visual working memory drops to just 1 to 2 items. That is the physical limit of bilingual remapping and structural bottlenecks. If you approach a system with unmediated, high-entropy communication, you aren't just being expressive, you are completely exceeding those 1 to 2 slots and crashing the system.
So how do we communicate safely within these strict biological limits? Let's conclude with Section 6, Protecting Your Baseline.
When you overload someone's limited working memory, you trigger a very specific response. You map the exact, narrow coordinates of the KATP bioenergetic break. This channel acts as a strict biological firewall, forcing an involuntary cognitive freeze to clear the terminal. If you've ever seen someone completely blank out when put on the spot, you are witnessing that KATP break in real time.
To safely navigate this bottleneck without triggering that freeze state, a system availability thinker uses structured scaffolding, like the PREP framework. Point, reason, example, point. By stating your point to set a coordinate, giving a reason to bypass the amygdala's alarm, anchoring it with a concrete example, and restating the point to lock the resolution, you're executing the ultimate low-entropy pause protocol. You deliver high-fidelity data perfectly formatted for those 1 to 2 working memory slots.
I want to end with this incredibly powerful mandate from the research. Stopping your endless parallel sequencing when a terminal is dark is not a surrender of your brilliance. It is the active preservation of your system's capital. By deliberately remapping your reality away from the holiday mindset and adopting system availability thinking, you secure true cognitive abundance. You protect the master builder, you, so that you actually have the metabolic vigor to run the shop when the environment finally resets. It proves that the only path to true abundance is the roamer's deliberate remapping of reality. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. What open-loop simulations are secretly draining your ATP right now, and exactly how will you choose to protect your baseline today?